Good morning, all. Thank you for joining the Cybersecurity Assessment meeting led by Team New Zealand. Let's begin with introductions first. My name is Sindhu. I am the Cybersecurity Governance Risk and Controls Lead for Team New Zealand, and I will be facilitating today's session. We also have here New Zealand's Security Architecture Lead Rex, Security Engineering Lead Shanice, and the Security Assurance Lead, Joseph. Let's look at the agenda for this presentation. We will be identifying the risks and vulnerabilities that led to the attack here at the summit. And to begin, we will briefly discuss what our risk assessment is. We will identify the current measures in place by Team New Zealand for authorization, authentication, and access controls. We will also review the organizational weaknesses or vulnerabilities that have been identified for Team New Zealand in the form of people, technology, and policies. Following that, we will look at some of the attack vectors associated with Team New Zealand. We'll also discuss the attribution analysis that was performed, the vulnerability assessment matrix that has all of the vulnerabilities that were identified, that has all of the prioritized vulnerabilities that were identified. We'll discuss those. And then lastly, we will have some of the recommendations that the Team New Zealand came up with to ensure that the identified vulnerabilities are mitigated appropriately and the risk is reduced to an acceptable level. National Institute of Standard and Technology defines risk assessment as the process of identifying risks to organizational operations, including mission functions, image, reputation, organizational asset, individual, other organizations, and the nation, resulting from the operation of an information system. Part of risk management incorporates threats and vulnerabilities analysis and considers mitigation provided by security controls planned or in place. It is important to note here that NIST definition is supported by New Zealand as well as the other 5 members present here at the summit. Let us now discuss the key principles of access control system. There are it's basically divided into 3 categories: authentication, authorization, and access control. Access control is the ability to make use of any information system resource. Access control is the process to grant permission to the resources for information system access. Access control basically defines the rules, policies for authentication and authorization. Examples would be application access that grants the capability to operate an application at runtime. There are different types of access controls. Discretionary access control, which is managed by the owner of the requester. There is role-based access control, where permissions are granted based on the role function of the user. There's attribute-based access control, where permissions are based on the attribute policy. And then there's mandatory access control. Systems manage controls based on organizational policies. Authentication is the process or action of verifying the identity of a user, process, or device, often as a prerequisite to allow user to resources in an information system. Authentication ensures the user is who they say they are by validating user's identity either by password, token, or biometric scan. example would be someone logging into their email account using a user ID password. Um, there are um, the process has three authentication mechanisms: something you know, which is a password or a PIN; something you have, like a security token, VPN, an ATM card; and something that you have. And this mechanism is generally called the biometrics, where it's either fingerprint or your voice recognition, retinal scan. Authentication can also be single factor, two factor, or multi factor. Single factor is when there's a username, a password, or a PIN. Two factor is using something that you have. So, for example, like a ATM card and a PIN. And then multi factor is combination of two or more authentication mechanism: a password, PIN, a challenge, question, response. Authorization is the process of determining the type of access that specific resource may require, including granting or denying of access permission to a user, program, or process. This step happens after authentication. Once it is ensured that the resource is who they say they are, which is authentication, authorization is to verify what they can or cannot do. So it's one example would be validation of what user action, read, write, execute, can a user execute. Um, Another example would be only a few application users are given privileged backend database access. This access is done and verified through authorization. Threat is an action or potential action that can cause damage, harm, or loss by exploiting vulnerabilities. Threats can be categorized as malicious or unintentional. Threats can be further classified as internal or external. Security threats are everywhere, and their effectiveness depends on how vulnerable the organization's network computers are. In this context, vulnerability is any weakness, gap in a security program or system that can be exploited by threats to gain unauthorized access to assets, people, property, or information. There are several vulnerabilities in the organization's security that can result in successful exploitation of these vulnerabilities and or threats. These vulnerabilities could be in the form of people, technology, and policy. People-related organizational weaknesses can be due to lack of insider threat mitigation program. Um, People-related can also be key person dependency. The insider threats can be malicious, negligent, as well as people-related includes external malicious attackers too. Organizational weaknesses due to that are people-related can be due to insufficient knowledge of security measures, a lack of a security program, um, failure to adhere to security measures um, by a negligent insider. People-related vulnerabilities are generally exploited through social engineering mechanisms. Um, One of the techniques used is the phishing email to gain access to the person's credentials and exploit the user credential and gain unauthorized access to the system or network. Some of the organizational weaknesses and vulnerabilities related to technology include design flaws. It includes lack of network segmentation, which would result in an attacker gaining access to the whole network if they were able to compromise one of the endpoints. In general, lack of security controls. This includes lack of appropriate access controls, least privilege being one of those, lack of redundancies in case of an incident and the data being compromised, um, mm, lack of encryption, where the attackers will able in case of an attack will be able to access information if the communication is unencrypted, and lack of vulnerability scanning and patching to make sure the systems are updated with the latest updates available um, for the systems, or the vulnerability scanning that will ensure that the systems are being scanned appropriately and the vulnerabilities are being identified and mitigated timely. Lastly, having organizational weaknesses, vulnerabilities related to policy affects the whole entire organization. An effective cybersecurity program includes well established policies to ensure appropriate management and enforcement of the organization's program, cybersecurity program strategy, and goals. Having a poor encryption and data classification policy will allow um, for the threat actors to gain access to um, to critical information. Inadequate access control policy is another one of the weaknesses um, related to policy that can make it easier for a threat actor to gain access and information to critical systems. Lastly, um, not having or not having an incident response policy in place, or an incident response policy that is updated and reviewed periodically in place to ensure that the organization is ready in case of an incident. The first step to identify an attacker is to determine all possible attack vectors. An attack vector is a pathway or method used by a hacker to illegally access a network or system to exploit system vulnerabilities. There are various attack vectors that a hacker um, can use to take advantage of the system weakness, cause a data breach, or steal login credential. Some of the attack vectors identified by Team New Zealand during the risk assessment at the summit include the following: phishing email, malware, ransomware, insider threat, poor encryption, and man in the middle. Attribution analysis is the process by which the identity and associated attributes of an attacker are affirmed. It can be difficult because of the relative anonymity provided by the internet and the increasing sophistication of the threat actors, also in some cases due to the lack of resources. It is an important step as it can help understand the motive and help with the future planning as well. With the attacker confirmed, the organization can plan for whom the response might be against. It often involves an extensive forensic investigation process involving digital forensic evidence, historical data, and, as mentioned previously, establishing the intent and motive for the attack. Vulnerability assessment is the process of identifying, quantifying, and prioritizing the vulnerabilities in a system. Once a threat is identified, vulnerability assessment is performed. Vulnerability assessment considers the potential impact of the loss from a successful attack, as well as the vulnerability of the system to an attack. Vulnerability assessment matrix is used to consolidate the prioritized vulnerability data. Team New Zealand created the shown vulnerability assessment matrix here to link the identified vulnerabilities to a category, threat, attack vector, and assess risk level. Vulnerability matrix help with the prioritization of the vulnerability and the mitigation strategy to close high risk items before moving on to the medium and the low risk vulnerabilities. Once the vulnerabilities have been identified, the next step is to come up with a plan to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Um, Based on the vulnerability assessment matrix discussed previously, some of the recommendations to reduce this risk to an acceptable level are as below. First and foremost, the 5i members should update their policies and procedures. This includes the cybersecurity policy, the mobile device management policy, the incident response policy. In general, there should be a requirement in place to regularly review and update the policies and procedures. In addition to that, the next recommended step is strengthening of the access control, authorization, and authentication measures in place. This includes implementing the multi-factor authentication, employing the principle of least privilege, allowing only authorized access is necessary to perform the job functions, and assign tasks for a defined period. We also recommend conducting a periodic vulnerability assessment. Vulnerability assessments should be conducted quarterly to ensure that the vulnerabilities are being identified and mitigated appropriately. We also recommend developing a procedure to conduct periodic independent review of the logging practices to ensure appropriate log management. All applications should be up to date, and a patch management program can help ensuring that the applications are being patched with the latest patches available. Lastly, we recommend a security awareness training for each and every employee, including the management, that ensure that the users are aware of the latest social engineering tactics being employed by the attackers. This brings us to the end of this presentation. You're more than welcome to reach out to anybody on our team if you have any questions. We also wanted to take this time to say thank you to each of the 5i members. It was a pleasure meeting you all over the past few days here at the summit, and the opportunity to learn from all of you. Thank you and have a great day.